And I'm joined tonight by Ella Whelan and my good fella. Great to see you both. Thanks for joining us this Saturday evening. Why don't we start, Ella, with the front of the Observer. Their headline, Johnson faces revolt on COVID dictates as poll figures slump. Talk to us about this.
Yeah, so probably unsurprisingly for most people watching, Johnson doesn't seem to be faring very well. Not just because of the mishaps over the last 6 months, but specifically because of the shambles, as it's called elsewhere in the papers, about the announcements of the restrictions. You know, the kind of sense that this is what's coming out of the government is sort of right down to the wire, last minute. Sometimes made up, sometimes based on the science, sometimes not, sometimes political manoeuvring. And there's not a huge amount of trust in him anymore. And the Observer picks up on the fact that they ran a poll organised by Opinion, which showed that Labour had overtaken the Tories for the first time since Keir Starmer became the leader in April. And it focuses on this fact that they're, according to this survey that they've carried out, that Keir Starmer seems to be just about by sort of 2 or 3 or 4 percentage points nudging ahead of Johnson in terms of who would be a better leader. And it's an interesting point, you know, whether or not who would be a better leader, who is going to be able to deal with this crisis. The article also focuses on the fact that Johnson's facing this backlash, mainly around the fact that MPs feel incredibly left out of the process. You know, infamously at this point now, the sort of raft of restrictions that came in not so long ago, including the rule of 6, were announced, what was it, something like 15 minutes before they came into law. It was really ridiculous. And so thankfully, I think some MPs, at least a group of them, are saying that this kind of, if you're going to make these kinds of law changes, then they do have to have some semblance of democracy, even if you are making the case that we're in strange times that deserve emergency action. This just isn't going to do.
Although it is interesting, Ella, isn't it, listening to Keir Starmer being interviewed by Sophie Ridge on Sunday last week. And Keir Starmer was saying that in many aspects he is supporting Boris Johnson and the government in some of the things they're doing, like, for example, the rule of 6. He has issues, of course, with the way it's carried out. But it's interesting to see that actually he is supportive of the measures.
Oh yeah, this poll that's been done by the Observer seems strange to me because we're sorely lacking in an opposition. I don't think that Labour and Keir Starmer should just pick holes in what the government's doing simply to be oppositional. But there's a huge amount that the government's doing at the moment that needs to be criticised and challenged. And there's this kind of, to my point of view, this kind of almost cowardly approach on behalf of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party to seem like they don't want to rock the boat. And while any sensible person can understand that you need a unified force to attack a virus, something which isn't subject to political whims necessarily, there is a huge amount more that Labour could be being vocal about, not just testing, but the means through which these restrictions are being brought in, the effects that they're having on people's lives, and how we deal with the virus at large. So I'm not one of those people that thinks Keir Starmer would do any better of a job.
Maya, what are your thoughts on this? Two issues here, really, aren't there? The opposition's view on how things are being done, and also the rebellious Tory MPs.
Yeah, so this is like part of the story, as you've said, is to do with these so-called rebellious Tory MPs, and this is a story that sort of rumbled on over the past few days, and I think we can expect to see this pick up pace in the coming week. And this is really to do with the fact that Graham Brady, who is the chair of the Backbench 1922 committee, is trying to drum up support for an amendment that will call for MPs to be allowed to debate and vote upon any kind of new measures before they're implemented. And so actually what we maybe will see is there is some speculation in this Observer article that they might actually pick up support from the Labour Party and from the SNP, as well as maybe some others. And this is really ahead of, on Wednesday, ministers are going to try and seek a 6-month extension to special powers that allow them to unilaterally make some of these decisions over coronavirus. And I think that it is really, really important to have parliamentary scrutiny of these measures. We understand, you know, the urgency of the situation, how serious the pandemic is, but there was concern from groups like the human rights organization Liberty at the time around how long some of these measures would last, the powers that it would give to government and to ministers. And so I think that it's understandable that there is this reaction from MPs, but I guess from Boris Johnson's point of view, if you want to think about maybe how he will see this, is it sort of questions his position and his authority a bit. And I think that they're trying to placate, the government are trying to placate some of these MPs by saying there will be a vote on the rule of six. But actually, Graham Brady suggested this simply isn't good enough. And so there does need to be further scrutiny, and there will be pushback in Parliament from MPs, Tory MPs, and also potentially opposition the opposition too.
And Maya, just staying with you very briefly, just fill us in on this story on the front of the Sunday Times, talking about the issues that the government has had. The headline here: World-beating shambles dogs NHS testing app.
Yeah, so this is really a story that says that millions of people are not going to be able to use the coronavirus tracing app that has just been rolled out on Thursday, after 5 months, actually, after it was supposed to have, after Matt Hancock announced its existence. And one of the problems, the main problem really, is that the COVID-19 test results taken from surveys by the Office for National Statistics and those taken from via the NHS and Public Health England can't be reported. And I just think this is another sort of thing to add to the absolutely shambolic response that we've seen. I just would very quickly say that it is an absolute, it's unbelievable and completely shocking that we still don't have a fully functioning test and trace app up and running. Yeah. And I think that is explains a lot of the problems we're seeing across the country with universities.
What I will just say, Ella, is we have had a statement tonight from the Department of Health saying everyone who receives a positive test result can log their results on the app. A minority of people, as you were saying, such as hospital patients who are unable to log their positive result, can now request a code when contacted by NHS Test and Trace to input into the app. So it does seem, and maybe the papers haven't had a chance to update this in their early editions. But Ella, nonetheless, the app doesn't seem to have been working as it should when it was released.
Yeah, well, maybe the government's playing catch-up again, which seems to me far more likely. They have definitely not got their ducks in a row, as Maya says, when it comes to test and trace. I mean, there's been a huge amount of money blown on this, almost £11 million. And the other fact is that there are people working in... Yes, but there are people working in test centres. My little brother's one of them, for minimum wage at test centres that are completely overrun, completely unmanageable. The whole system seems to be breaking down around their ears. As Maya says, they don't seem to be able to get one part of this system right. And as we keep being told, this is a virus that we're going to have to live with. And if we're going to live with it without being locked down, locking students up, locking old people up, locking all types of different people up at different times, you have to have a proper test and trace system in place. And this app is what Matt Hancock is so fond of apps. We know that before he became sort of centre stage in this pandemic, he was the lame app guy that people sometimes rolled out on Radio 4 to talk about his latest invention. And this isn't going to be the magic bullet for this pandemic. The government sort of kind of has to get real at this point and do things properly, take the time to do things properly, rather than splurging money on something that, as is quoted here, seems like a shambles.
OK, and Maya, we've just got 20 seconds left to talk about the pictures in the Sunday Express. Protesters taking on the police. This was a lockdown rally held in Trafalgar Square.
Yeah, and you have seen a number of these different rallies in different places around Europe and across the world of people I think it's sort of a mix of different people who make up some of these rallies, and there's been some concerns around actually the potential spreading of the virus at some of these rallies. But I do think that some of this does go back to really having the government needing to have very clear communications and explaining exactly why they're putting all these measures in place. Not that is to explain the entirety of why these kinds of protests are happening, but I do think that would go some way to sort of explaining to people exactly what is happening and why.
Yeah, OK, we'll leave it there for the moment. Ella, Maya, thank you very much indeed. Coming up, why museums are being told to stop pulling down statues. Discussing that and more in a couple of minutes. Hello again, you're watching part 2 of the Press Preview. Ella Whelan and Maya Goodfellow still with me. Maya, why don't we start with you this time? Front page of the Times, the Sunday Times. BBC critics set for top jobs in broadcasting.
Yeah, so this is really a story that is in a few different places, including the Sunday Times, that says that Boris Johnson has asked the former Mail editor Paul Dacre to run the media watchdog Ofcom, and has also asked Charles Moore to be the BBC chairman. And there's some suggestions that a deal has almost been done with Charles Moore. And I think we really need to wait and see exactly what happens here, because quite obviously this kind of story really plays right into the kind of narrative that the government wants, which is like the culture wars. And whilst I'm not someone who would defend the way our media works in its entirety, I have a number of critiques of it, and I don't think that Britain is this fair meritocracy. I do think that if this is accurate, then it's a real problem that the proper process for neither job has actually opened up yet. So they haven't been advertised. Proper process hasn't even set in motion. And the way that it would read is, if this does happen, is it would just simply look like the government stitching up jobs for their friends, posts that should be about independence. I think it would be really quite worrying if they were going to insist on putting their allies and their friends in these kinds of positions of power and influence. And I think that is one of the most alarming things about this, but we do need to wait and see exactly how accurate this is and exactly what happens here.
Yeah, you make a very good point. I mean, speculation, Ella, isn't particularly helpful, is it? Especially as the application process hasn't even begun yet.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, the article is quite remarkable. It's in entirety. It quotes Dimbleby at one point talking about making them the enemies of the people, which is a very controversial line. It's funny. I wonder if anyone's going to get their knickers in a twist over it coming out of Dimbleby's mouth. But of course, the problem for me anyway, the problem with Ofcom at the moment won't be solved by putting Dacre in or anything like that. The issue is it's become a kind of a place where people go to complain about politics that they don't like on the television. So it was Diversity doing a sort of Black Lives Matter supporting performance, and Alicia Dixon with a necklace one week. Another week it's people complaining about something else. And the issue of the BBC and whether they're biased seems to flip-flop between their two left or their two right week to week. They could do with someone in the position of power who's going to champion freedom for more interesting and maybe more boundary-pushing programmes. But I'm not convinced that even if it is Dacre that gets the job, that he'll be the man to do that.
OK. And people getting their knickers in a twist, Maya, about museums being told to stop pulling down statues or risk funding cuts. It's a story that The Telegraph's got.
Yeah, so I'm not really convinced by this. So this is this story that government-funded museums and galleries have been told that they shouldn't be removing statues or other artefacts as a result of campaigning. And this is off the back of the letter written by the Culture Secretary. And I actually haven't heard of any being removed. I don't know, I don't follow this that closely. But the most I've actually heard of is a statue being moved within a museum to be given more context. And I actually think it's really important that we remember that this isn't what most of the anti-racist movement is about in Britain. Most people, if they're talking about history, they're just asking for Britain's bloody colonial history to be put as a statutory part of the curriculum. And most people actually are really focused on material inequality. So thinking about those material forms of inequality that impact people of colour across the UK, and how we do something more about that to make sure that people have a much fairer chance of things like housing and jobs, pay. Those are the things that were really exposed by the coronavirus pandemic. When we see the outcome of people of colour being some of the worst groups of people being impacted, if you look at the finer detail of that, you find that is related to social inequality, so things like overcrowded housing, poor pay, and being able to access healthcare.
OK, Ella, I want you to come back on this one very quickly before we just finish off with the front of the Mail.
Yeah, well, I mean, the issue is, not to sound like a broken record, but freedom in the arts and in culture. And part of the problem with the move to the calls from some, as Maya points out, some, not all anti-racist campaigners, to kind of remove any instances, especially in America, actually, any instances of statues that might be politically controversial or offensive, as they put it, is an attack on freedom in the arts and culture. But even more so, perhaps, is the Culture Secretary trying to strong-arm museums into not being able to curate, which essentially is what moving a statue around is part of a curation process. So way to answer a kind of a mess in the kind of culture wars, as they put it, in museums, with more clamping down on censorship. It's not a good sign.
OK, interesting point. And just staying with you, Ella, very quickly, tell us about the front of the Mail, and then we'll get Maya's views on it.
Yes. So, I mean, this just it has to make you laugh. There's little to laugh about at the moment. Trying to hook it off a serious thing in relation to what's going to happen with the trade deals struck between the UK and the US. Jamie Oliver and Joe Wicks, two people very famous in the kind of cooking world. Jamie probably more so. Joe finding fame throughout the lockdown with his badgering kids to work out in the sitting room, are kind of shouting about chlorinated chicken and the rise of bad food coming into the UK if we do a certain deal with the US. Can I just remind everyone that Jamie Oliver was ridiculed by children on national television about chicken nuggets? He's not an expert in terms of what the public wants.
Maya, what do you think? Fitness guru and chef, are they the right people to be making these sort of statements? 10 seconds.
I don't know. I think it's sort of inevitable they're going to be doing stuff like this. I think the thing that's most concerning and we should all be watching out for is what those trade deals look like and what it means for people in the UK.
Yeah. OK. Great to speak to you both. We'll see you again in half an hour. Ella Whelan, Maya Goodfellow, thank you very much indeed. Plenty more, a couple of minutes. And time to chat now to Ella Whelan and Maya Goodfellow. Great to see you both again. Maya, should we start with the front of the Observer then? Boris Johnson facing revolt on COVID diktats as poll figures slump. That's according to the Observer.
Yeah, in a way, this is sort of a story of two parts. And the first part is this a story that has sort of been in the news already, but I think will be increasingly in the news as we head into the next week, which is that Graham Brady, who is the chair of the Backbench 1922 committee, so quite a well-known Conservative, is picking up more support or trying to drum up more support for an amendment which would actually mean that MPs would be allowed to debate and vote upon any kind of new measures that are implemented in relation to coronavirus. And this sort of comes in relation to, on Wednesday, the government are going to ministers are going to try and seek a 6-month extension to powers that had already been introduced that allow them to unilaterally implement different measures in relation to coronavirus. And the government sort of tried to placate some of these backbench MPs by saying, oh, we'll actually allow you to vote on the rule of 6 rule. But Graham Brady suggests this isn't enough. And actually what we maybe can expect is that what the Observer article says is that they may well pick up support from the Labour Party and the SNP and others. And I do think it's really important that whilst the government does need to act quickly around coronavirus and be rather agile, it is really important that these kinds of powers and these rules are debated in Parliament. But the other part of the story is that the Labour Party has, for the first time since Keir Starmer became Labour leader earlier this year, has moved ahead in the polls ahead of Boris Johnson's Conservative Party. And I think that will be welcome news to the Labour Party, but there's still some criticisms of Keir Starmer in relation to maybe him being too quiet and not forthcoming enough on some of these major issues around coronavirus and sort of what the vision is for the country.
OK, Ella, let's get your thoughts on this. I mean, I don't think this headline's going to keep Boris Johnson awake tonight, is it?
Perhaps not. But then it can't be just me that thinks that there's definitely not only because he was obviously very seriously ill for a while with coronavirus, that the stuffing has been knocked out of Johnson, partly because this is obviously an incredibly difficult job and no prime minister has had to face this kind of situation before. But also I think because the Conservatives came out of the general election in 2019 sort of live and kicking with this idea that they were going to be the party that, recaptured a sense of democracy, that Johnson was lauded as someone who was big into liberties and individual freedom and not going down a kind of nanny state route and all these sorts of things. And of course, time and again, it's been proven that he is flailing, quite frankly, and not able to stick to any kind of logic or ideology throughout this. There doesn't seem to be a plan, is what I'm trying to say, throughout this pandemic. And the crucial point to make is that this didn't have to be the case. I was looking back through old articles and saw something from March, Jenny Harries at the time talking about the measures that were put in place back then, saying, well, it could be a few weeks, it could be 3 months, but I mean, it could be 6 months, but I mean, who knows? And now, of course, we're facing an entire year almost.
But that's the point, isn't it? Nobody knew, Ella. Nobody knew.
Nobody knew then, but I think back in August, when we'd had a serious amount of time to deal with this virus and we'd seen the trends and there was a lot more data out there, there was a decision to be made, I think, which was how much risk are we willing to take? At what parts in society is freedom important to us? And I think the problem with what's going on with the government restrictions is not that a lot of people support them and want to fight the virus and all that kind of thing, but there doesn't seem to be any logic to it. It's quite clear that we can't continue to do things like they're doing to students in Glasgow, is it, up in Scotland, of locking them indoors. We can't keep older people who are vulnerable isolated, can't go on living like this for 6 months until Christmas. It's sort of inhuman. And so the question is, has this had proper scrutiny, and is this what the public wants? And those that you can't simply bring in almost by decree these measures without consulting the public.
OK, and that, of course, is one of the reasons why the Test and Trace app is so important. And the Sunday Times scathing headline, world-beating shambles dogs NHS testing app. Maya, just tell us about this.
Yeah, so what this story is saying is that millions of people aren't able to use the government's coronavirus app, which they'd talked about initially 5 months ago. And it's saying that it emerged yesterday that there's issues with people who've had their test results through the information coming from the National Statistics and also through the NHS and Public Health England, so they can't be reported on the app. And I actually think, regardless of the specifics of this story, there is a much bigger problem around the fact that we are months and months on. The government has had months to put in place a functioning test and trace system. Part of the reason we have these major issues with university students, you have schools in the area that I live. I know that there's at least one school where a whole year group of children have had to be learning from home because one child tested positive coronavirus and the rest of the year group isn't able to get tests, and their education is therefore suffering. This is happening because the test, track and trace is not functioning in the way that it needs to. If we look at other countries around the world, countries that have been able to control and manage the virus better, which is also good for the economy, we look at places like South Korea, we look at places like Taiwan, they have put these measures in place around the test and trace system. And I think that this is a major issue that really needs to be sorted out faster. And I would say that one of the big problems here is that this has been outsourced to companies like Serco, when what the government should have done and should be doing more of now is building up the capacity in local authorities and NHS within the NHS so that test and trace can be done locally and effectively. And I think that is the thing we all need to be focused on now, is making sure that happens, because that's the thing that will mean we have to have less restrictions and less tighter restrictions.
Yeah, and I should just add that the Department of Health has tonight said that they have now fixed that flaw. So we'll wait and see whether it sort of translates to people being able to use the app more successfully. Just before the break, Ella, I know you want to talk about this story, so we'll bring it in next. Sunday Express. This is all about the protesters taking on the police in the lockdown rally taking place in Trafalgar Square this afternoon.
You know, this is a really interesting story. It was a really interesting event that took place today, because I think it shows the complexity of the situation we're dealing with. So at these protests, there's a real mix of people. On the one hand, there's some very serious conspiracy theorists there, and some of the placards that you'll see will have the kind of classic wake up sheeple vibe to them that all good conspiracy theories have, about forced vaccinations and all kinds of things and saving children. On the other hand, there is a huge amount of people there who are very not just upset, but really angered by what we've just been talking about, by the fact that the government is bringing in measures that don't seem to have any relation to what people need in terms of support or protection or even regulation. So it's a real mix. And I think it opens up the question. And also, as a side point, one of the pictures here that's put out is of riot police coming in and charging protesters. I have it on good authority by two people who were there out of curiosity that the riot police only moved in as the rally was over. So you conclude from that what you want. But the question is, how do people who have disquiet about what's going on, who aren't COVID idiots, who aren't conspiracy theorists, but are nervous, to say the least, about the fact that we could be moving towards a position in which government is instituting emergency powers with no end in sight. What do? You don't want to risk people, you don't want to go out and potentially spread the virus, but at what point are people able to voice their opinions and challenge the government on this? So it's a really complicated but interesting picture.
Maya, we've only got about 20 or 30 seconds, but I suppose it's worth saying, isn't it, that this wasn't a huge rally. There are a few thousand people, but it wasn't big numbers.
No, but no, and I do think that there is. I do think that going forward and carrying on, there does need to be really, really clear communications about what the rules are and why. And I think this needs to be done in the most sensible way possible. And what we've seen from government is, although there has been some corrections earlier on in the year around really mixed messaging, is it hasn't been as consistent as it needs to be. Things haven't been explained as they need to be. And as I said before, for me, this just always comes back to the test and trace. That is the key to all of this, and it is absolutely scandalous that that is still not working in the way that it needs to be. And I think that needs to be fixed now.
OK, great to get your thoughts. Stay where you are. Coming up, the debate over which words we should or shouldn't be allowed to use on the internet. Stay with us. Welcome back. Time for part two of the press preview. Ella Whelan and Maya Goodfellow still with me. Front page of the Sunday Times. Maya, BBC critics set for top jobs in broadcasting. Bit of a misleading headline, this one.
Yeah, so what this is a story that's in a few of the papers, and it's that Boris Johnson has asked the former Mail editor Paul Dacre to run the media watchdog Ofcom, and has also asked Charles Moore to be the next BBC chairman. And we do need to wait and see what happens here. There is a process that for both of these appointments that hasn't actually opened yet. So the applications for this haven't opened, and so actually, reading into this, I was looking at some of how these appointments are actually made. Is there is a clear process, but actually the Prime Minister and ministers do ultimately get the final say. And so I think that we should be watching this one to see what happens, because if it does happen in this way and these two people are appointed, the way that it reads is these jobs sort of being stitched up for the Prime Ministers and the government's friends, essentially, in posts that actually should be independent. And I think this would be really worrying if you were sort of if there was this sort of move to insist on having your allies and your friends in these positions of power and influence. So I think this is definitely one to watch to see how it develops.
Yeah, Ella, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I largely agree with that. Obviously with the proviso that I don't think anyone is under the illusion that, appointments at the BBC or Ofcom or any of these bodies or institutions were ever done on a kind of basis of surveying the public and, picking people at random, or a kind of meritocracy option. But on the other hand, the point is, if you're going to be dealing with the issue of BBC bias, and it's accused by both right and left, or a kind of stifling of what I'm more worried about is a stifling kind of growth of censorship in television broadcasting, in the arts, in making programmes. Someone like Dacre, with his obsession with fake news and clamping down on social media platforms, might not necessarily be the greatest choice. He comes with his own political biases. What Ofcom, I think, needs is less stress on trying to fret about what kind of political viewpoint is put out on the BBC or elsewhere, and more just dealing with the nuts and bolts of the kind of technicalities of what should and shouldn't be within the law put out on television.
Yeah, well, which brings us on to the story in the Mail. New free speech battle as MPs try to ban harmful words from the web. Explain this one, Ella.
Well, it's been bubbling like many of these stories, it's kind of been bubbling for a long time. And this is a new report come out by the think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies, which is looking at the government's preparations to bring in a new online harms bill. And the thing that jumps out from it that the Centre for Policy Studies has focused on is this plan to make a new category of speech that is legal but harmful. So in essence, and in theory, you could have an article or something taken down, even if it's legal, but if it's harmful. And it's that use of the word harmful which is so woolly and so open to abuse. And Ruth Smeeth, who's was a Labour MP, introduced Keir Starmer, was it this week, and is the chief executive of the Index on Censorship, points out the fact that, you can't regulate speech in this way, or you shouldn't. It seems like the government is hell-bent on doing it, but you shouldn't, because what's harmful to me or you might not be harmful to the next person. I mean, what does that even mean? Harmful speech is an incredibly subjective term, and this is first and foremost, this is attack on freedom of speech, of which we need far less of. We need to be championing freedom of speech. Yeah,
a government spokesman says we've set out plans for proportionate regulation which prioritises the protection of children while safeguarding people's rights and ensuring we maintain a free and open internet. Maya, final thought from you on this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think these things really matter and should be scrutinised. I would want to look at this more closely to see exactly what the ins and outs of it means in terms of how this would actually work and what it means, as Ella has said, in relation to sort of deeming things to be harmful. So I think this is one where I would really want to look at the finer detail.
OK, you can read more about that in the Mail on Sunday. Ella and Maya, thank you both very much indeed. Great to see you. Have a good rest of the weekend. Let's take a quick look at the weather.